I've put it off long enough, and I think it's finally time to talk about Mario's games on the Game Boy.
Yeah!
Specifically these. These are all the games on the Game Boy that Mario has headlined. And yes, I know he has appeared in many more games than this, but these are the only games in which he has been the main playable character. Now, my original plan was to talk about these over 3 separate videos, but I think getting them all done at once is probably the best way to minimize the impact of a potential copyright claim from Nintendo. So, I don't know, let's go. This is Shigeru Miyamoto. He is known largely as being the man behind Mario and Legend of Zelda, and has generally become the family-friendly, fun-loving celebrity face of Nintendo. However, if Miyamoto is the face of Nintendo, Gunpei Yokoi was its cybernetic endoskeleton. Miyamoto became famous for being the creator of Donkey Kong, Mario, and The Legend of Zelda, but Yokoi and his R&D1 development team made, well, pretty much everything else. Many of my favorite first-party NES games can be traced back to Gunpei Yokoi rather than Miyamoto, but Yokoi's crowning achievement, at least in my mind, was the Game Boy. As the creator of the Game Boy, Yokoi and R&D1 also created many of the first-party games that launched with the system, most of which were modeled after the initial wave of black box NES games that had launched with the NES in 1985. By this point, Mario was synonymous with Nintendo, so he was naturally selected to be one of the MVPs of the Game Boy starting lineup, but with little, if any, involvement from the original development team behind Super Mario Bros. The fact that Mario was essentially on loan to an entirely new development team explains in part why it feels a little strange. But it wasn't as strange in 1989 as it appears now, with 35 years of Mario games to look back on. Remember that when the Game Boy originally came out in the US, Mario had really only starred in 2 other games, and these were so different from one another that they might as well have been from 2 completely different franchises. The fact that Mario was suddenly battling sphinxes and moai heads and piloting vehicles in side-scrolling shooter levels, well, it didn't really feel off-brand. At a glance, Super Mario Land follows the structure and mechanics established by the original Super Mario Bros. You run from left to right in a series of horizontally scrolling levels, breaking blocks to find secrets, and collecting coins to earn extra lives. Collecting a mushroom power-up will make Mario bigger, a flower will let him throw projectiles, and a star will grant him temporary invincibility. There are even a few familiar enemies like turtles, piranha plants, and this mushroom-like creature that appears to be some species of Goomba. But the devil, as they say, is in the details, and that's pretty much where these similarities end. For starters, this isn't the Mushroom Kingdom, this is Sarasa Land. Instead of a giant dragon turtle or a bubble-spewing toad, the main bad guy is an alien from outer space, and the game's damsel in distress is not Princess Peach, but Princess Daisy, in her first appearance in fact.
Hi, I'm Daisy!
Extra lives are granted by hearts instead of green mushrooms, and the flower power-up gives Mario the ability to throw super balls that bounce all over the screen, taking out enemies and collecting coins from a distance. Oh, and apparently Mario is transported to each stage in a UFO. This isn't explained in the game or in the manual, it just kinda happens, so go with it. The enemies in Mario Land also turn the Mario series on its head. These turtles appear to be the same Koopa Troopas from Super Mario Bros., but these will drop a bomb when you stomp on them, which will damage you if you don't jump out of the way quickly enough. There are giant jumping spiders and bouncing moai heads with wings, robots that fling their heads at you like frisbees, chickens with flight helmets, and these Jiangshi enemies straight out of Chinese folklore. Koji Kondo's iconic Mario Bros. Score is also noticeably absent, replaced by entirely original music from Hirokazu "Hip" Tanaka. Tanaka had provided the music for many R&D1 developed games up to this point, like Metroid, Kid Icarus, and Balloon Fight, but the music in Super Mario Land is quite possibly one of his best works. In fact, Mario Land's soundtrack, in my not-so-humble opinion, is better than the music from Super Mario Bros. 1 and 3. Changed my mind. Graphically, Super Mario Land isn't an ugly game by any means, but it definitely looks like an early Game Boy game. However, there was an effort made to preserve the same character-to-screen dimensions from the console Mario games. All the characters appear roughly the same size on the Game Boy screen as they appeared on the NES, which on one hand means that the sprites are tiny and minimally detailed, but on the other hand it also avoids the claustrophobia that came with larger, more detailed sprites. Neither solution is perfect, but if I had a choice, I'd say that Mario Land's preservation of gameplay at the expense of graphical detail is the better one. As the Mario sequels rolled in over the years, Super Mario Land stood out further and further from the rest of the games. Despite the fact that the Mario series for the most part avoided feeling formulaic by constantly reinventing itself from game to game, there are certain tropes that the most successful Mario games adhere to pretty strictly. And the games that deviate from these tropes tend to get overlooked or outright dismissed by all but a small number of fans. Super Mario Land is definitely more fondly remembered than, say, Super Mario Sunshine. But by and large, it has been overshadowed by the games that more accurately portray what a Mario game is supposed to be like. Even the planet-hopping escapades of Mario Galaxy felt completely grounded within the Mario universe, while Super Mario Land is just a weird little fever dream where Mario piloted a submarine and fought an alien. Weirdness aside, Mario Land absolutely delivered on its promise of bringing the Mario experience on the go. It was one of the first Game Boy games I owned as a kid, and over the years it has remained one of my most frequently played games on the system, alongside Gargoyle's Quest and Fall of the Foot Clan. Mario Land 2 is as different from the original Mario Land as Super Mario World was from the original Super Mario Bros. I'll go even further by saying that Mario Land 2 is more like Mario World than Mario Land 1 was like Super Mario 1, and I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment. The premise of the game is that Mario has returned from his adventures in Sarasa Land to find that his castle has been taken over by his childhood rival, Wario. In order to unlock the door to the castle and evict Wario, Mario first needs to travel around the world collecting the titular 6 golden coins from the various themed areas surrounding the castle. If nothing else, Mario Land 2 is a less linear game than Mario World, so the coins can be collected in any order. Graphically, the game draws from the art style of Mario 3 and Mario World. Mario himself more or less appears the same here as he did on the Super Nintendo, as do the familiar power-ups like the Super Mushroom and the Fire Flower. Mario Land 2 also continues the trend of introducing a brand new power-up that they can showcase on the box art. This time, Mario can collect a carrot to transform into Bunny Mario. Gotta feel stupid even saying that. Which allows him to jump extra high and float through the air by flapping his silly little bunny ears. As in Mario World, the game records your progress by the number of exits you found. A handful of stages contain secret exits to extra levels hidden on the map, but unlocking these extra levels doesn't mean you'll be able to freely access them. In most cases, you can only revisit these new levels via the secret exits in the original stages, which is a pretty boneheaded design choice if you ask me. Equally dumb is that you can only access the space zone by first going through this hippo bubble stage. Even after beating the zone boss, who is Tanaka from Mario Land 1 by the way, you can't directly access these space stages from the overworld map. Not a big fan of that. Mario Land 2 takes another cue from Mario World with its soundtrack. Much like what Koji Kondo did in Mario World, most of the music in Mario Land 2 is structured around a single theme, which is remixed in 5 or 6 ways to match the style of each stage. Now of course everyone loves the Star Maze Zone, which I admit is pretty good, but all I'm going to say about the rest of the soundtrack is that it's not nearly as good as the music from the original Mario Land. Now in case it isn't obvious already, I don't especially like Mario Land 2, and to be honest, I never really did. Now of course it's okay if you like the game and I'm not going to try to change your mind, but for everyone who hasn't already clicked off the video, I'd like to try to explain what I didn't like about the game. There was a time in the early 90s when it was extremely fashionable to try to emulate the look of popular Super Nintendo titles by trying to recreate those eye-popping 16-bit graphics on the Game Boy. Nintendo was especially guilty of this, but many other developers also got involved, resulting in games like Link's Awakening, the Donkey Kong Land games, Contra, the Alien Wars, Street Fighter II, Killer Instinct. Now I've always thought of this as SNES envy, but it could be realistically called 16-bit envy, as popular Genesis games also found their way onto the Game Boy, like Disney's Aladdin for example. Now I want to be very clear about this, I'm not talking about multi-platform games like Lemmings or Joe and Mac. where the publisher is trying to maximize profits by developing a version of a game for every video game system on the market. The games I'm talking about are clearly making a statement that despite how amazing these new 16-bit systems are with their Mode 7 effects and their blast processing, Nintendo desperately wants consumers to know that the Game Boy is still a legitimate video game system. This is the equivalent of a jealous child acting up during their sibling's birthday party because they don't like that someone else is getting all the attention. Now remember that I love the Game Boy, much more than either of the 16-bit consoles. But even as a kid, if anyone tried to tell me that the Game Boy could deliver the same experience as a Super Nintendo or Genesis game, or something that was even remotely similar, I called bullshit. Mario Land 2 tries very hard to essentially be Mario World on the Game Boy, and all it really accomplishes is highlighting all the ways that it's inferior to its source material. I'm pretty sure that this is exactly why I've always had such a problem with the Game Boy version of Mega Man 2. If you're going to be following an established formula this closely, you'd better make sure you get it right. Instead, Super Mario Land 2 plays more like a janky dollar store rehash of Super Mario World, clumsily regurgitating an assortment of mechanics and ideas from previous games, and coming up with very few worthwhile ideas of its own. It also fails to reproduce the subtle and critical details that actually make proper Mario games so endearing. Like, for example, personality. There's a lot of variety in the enemy design, but the enemies themselves are completely charmless, with extremely basic animations. And this applies to the stages themselves, which are also incredibly basic. Yeah, the levels are large and scroll in all directions. That in itself is pretty impressive, sure. But there's really not much to do in these stages other than work your way to the exit. There's very little engaging stage design to make the stages memorable for anything other than the way they look. There are countless stages from Mario 3 and Mario World that are extremely memorable for the obstacles they challenged you with and the innovative ways the game led you to the exits. But there's nothing memorable about the stages of Mario Land 2, other than vague aesthetic details like balls, Legos, and Halloween. The game is also utterly devoid of challenge right up to the very end. Wario's castle actually can be pretty tricky, although this difficulty spike is mainly due to the size of the Game Boy screen, combined with these slightly fuzzy controls. The castle is also the largest stage in the game and it doesn't provide any checkpoints. So if you lose a life while fighting Wario, you have to go through the entire stage all over again. Along with Link's Awakening, Mario Land 2 is commonly regarded as one of the very best games on the Game Boy. And I'm sure some people will be disappointed that I don't love it as much as they do. But honestly, these are opinions that I've held about the game since I originally played it as a kid, and my perception has not improved in the past 30 some odd years. As I've said before, a game doesn't have to be quote unquote bad for me to dislike it. And despite the fact that I think it is undeserving of the praise it gets, I can at least appreciate that most people love it as much as they do. Hello? One thing I will give Mario Land 2 credit for is the creation of Wario, who I've always felt was a great character. And apparently someone at Nintendo felt the same way, as Wario would take Mario's place as lead character in the Mario Land series, setting him on the path of a successful solo career that would take him into a future video, probably. Mario's next Game Boy adventure would see him returning to one of his oldest rivalries, and this time, he wouldn't even get his name on the box. Now, I completely missed out on this game when it first came out. By 1994, I had more or less moved on from the NES and the Game Boy, and since I didn't have a Super Nintendo, there was really no reason to renew my subscription to Nintendo Power when it lapsed in 1993. So when I originally played this game years later, I thought it was simply an updated version of the classic 1981 arcade game. And to be honest, I was actually fine with that. Donkey Kong on the Game Boy looks great. The layout of the boards have been cut down a bit to fit the Game Boy screen, but the new character designs look fantastic, especially Donkey Kong himself. What's more is that the entire arcade game is represented here, even the elusive Cement Factory stage, which for some reason never made it into the NES port. The play control has also been massively updated. The stiff controls from the arcade game have been replaced by the fluid responsiveness that you would expect from a proper Mario game. Looking at you, Marlene, too. New death animations have been added, and the height that Mario can fall without losing a life has been greatly increased. But if you're at all familiar with the arcade game, you already know how this goes. You chase Donkey Kong through multiple screens of this construction site, and after you've removed all the rivets on the final board, you're reunited with your girlfriend Peach. I mean, Pauline. Jeez, who knew Mario was such a lady killer? Now, I'm not sure exactly when I realized that the game kept going after that iconic end screen. Honestly, I think I played through those first 4 stages 2 or 3 times before I discovered that the game hadn't even started yet. Donkey Kong 94 continues for another 96 stages across 9 unique themed worlds. Each world has between 8 and 16 individual stages, and the objective for most of them is simply to grab the key and bring it to the door to move on to the next stage. Most of these stages are quite small and aren't too far removed from the structure of the original Donkey Kong arcade levels, but they are packed with obstacles and interesting mechanics that will test your problem-solving skills as much as your platforming abilities. Every world offers its own unique set of mechanics, like power lines and ropes that you need to vault yourself up from, switches that will let you control moving platforms and conveyor belts and locked doors, and temporary objects like ladders and springs that you'll need to strategically place and act quickly to use. And later in the game, you'll even have to contend with wind and ice physics. The jungle world introduces hanging vines with climbing mechanics straight out of Donkey Kong Jr. And then shortly after that, Jr. himself enters the game and becomes a regular adversary. The game is constantly introducing new concepts. It never lingers on one particular idea for more than a couple stages. Every 4 stage you'll square off against Donkey Kong in one of 2 types of encounters. The most common type of encounter operates just like the original arcade game, where the only objective is to just reach Pauline at the top of the stage. But each world also ends with a proper boss battle against Donkey Kong, where you have to knock him out by throwing his own barrels back at him. After each encounter, you're treated to a brief little cutscene that serves to introduce a new gameplay mechanic or highlight one of Mario's abilities. And speaking of abilities, the depth of Mario's moveset in this game is truly impressive, especially considering that this game predates Mario 64 by 2 or 3 years. He could do all the typical Mario stuff that you'd expect him to do, like jumping and climbing ladders, but he can also walk on his hands to protect himself from falling objects, or perform a backflip to jump extra high. Jumping from a headstand will also give Mario a height boost, and you can also chain together multiple jumps from a headstand to jump progressively higher and farther. And by the way, Mario himself isn't learning any new abilities during the course of the game. He could do all of this from the very beginning. By introducing these mechanics, the game is simply reminding you, the player, that Mario can do it. Finally, I of course have to mention that this is a Super Game Boy enhanced game. In fact, it may very well be the original Super Game Boy game. By playing Donkey Kong on the Super Game Boy adapter, the game receives a number of enhancements, like this cool arcade-style border, a custom color palette, and even some rudimentary voice samples. Although Pauline's cat-like cries for help become kind of irritating rather quickly. Donkey Kong 94 would receive its own sequels and spin-offs. It was followed up by Mario vs. Donkey Kong on the Game Boy Advance, which features more or less identical gameplay. Mario would take a more passive role in the subsequent sequels, with the mini Mario toys and their Lemmings-esque gameplay replacing the traditional platformer style from the previous games. Donkey Kong 94 is absolutely one of the very best games on the Game Boy. And in this case, it would seem that my opinion is more or less aligned with just about everyone else, as Donkey Kong is one of those games that usually ranks towards the top of all those top 10 Game Boy games of all time lists. Of course, Mario Land 2 is also one of those games, so there's no accounting for taste.
What?